Chapter 14. Please, gentlemen, would you take a seat? The man said as we entered the lieutenant colonel's office. He walked over and sat down on a chair right beside the ones we'd taken. The lieutenant colonel stood behind his desk and Bill waited off to the side. You gentlemen should sit as well, he said, and they each took a seat. I didn't know who this man was, but he was clearly older than the other two, and he certainly acted as though he was in charge. It's past tea time, but would either of you care for a cup, he asked. No, thank you, I said. We were hoping for a soda, Jack added. Wasn't that part of the bet? You'd mentioned a bet outside, the man said. I'm interested in pursuing that line of questioning, but first I must ask your forgiveness for my lack of manners. He reached out, offering his hand. Jack reached out his hand to shake. I'm Jack, and this is my brother George. He reached out and shook my hand next. I'm Bill, he said. There are two Bills? It is a common name. Many people refer to me as Little Bill, if that helps. He certainly wasn't nearly as tall or wide as our Bill. He was wearing a suit and tie and looked very gentle, almost friendly. His voice was soft and reassuring. He reminded me of a teacher or a minister. He had sort of a pointy nose, but what really stood out were his eyes. They were sharp and bright and penetrating. Now tell me about this bet, he said. It's nothing really, Bill said. It involves Mr. Granger from over at the DIL plant. He and I have this running. Excuse me? Little Bill cut him off, his voice rising slightly. I was asking the boys. Besides, shouldn't you be going and getting them their sodas? Well, I was just trying. He stopped mid-sentence as Little Bill's eyes flashed. Suddenly, he didn't seem like a teacher or minister. He looked angry and intense, and I felt frightened, even though he wasn't looking at me. I'll go right now, sir, Bill said, and then he spun on his heels briskly and left the room. Bill had called him sir, so whoever he was, he outranked him, even though he wasn't wearing a uniform. Now, what does this bet have to do with the DIL plant? Once again, his voice was quiet and calm, and his eyes were friendly. Bill asked us to deliver a fake bomb to the plant. Interesting. And when was this request made? Today. We did it today, Jack said. And can I assume you were successful? It was easy, I told him. We just walked in the front gate and asked if we could deliver a lunch to our mother. She works there, Jack added. And then Mr. Granger and Bill were talking, and they agreed to double the bet if we could break in here and deliver these to Bill, I said, offering him the box, which I was still holding. He took it from my hands and carefully removed the lid. Soggy cigars? They didn't start out soggy. My inner tube ripped open when we came over the waterfall, Jack explained. A waterfall? We didn't even know it was there until we went over it, I exclaimed. I certainly hope it wasn't too big a waterfall, he said kindly. Bigger than I would have liked, I said, and he chuckled softly in response. And how exactly did you come to navigate over a waterfall of any size? We were trying to sneak into the camp from Corbett's Creek. That's how we've done it before, Jack explained. Little Bill now turned to the lieutenant colonel. They've come onto the base before? 3 times, he answered hesitantly, but we did manage to capture them twice. I suppose I should be impressed by that percentage, Little Bill said, but he didn't sound impressed. That's partly where I got the idea for tricking those 2 men in the Jeep, I explained. I recognized them from before, and I knew that they knew us. So we just called them over, Jack continued. He turned to me. My brother just called them over. It was sort of like how we brought the bag of clay into the plant. We just acted like we belonged, and the guards thought we did. Little Bill didn't say anything. He was holding one of the cigars in his hands and rolling it back and forth deep in thought. These would certainly provide a very clever way to transport plastique, he said to the lieutenant colonel. I wonder how much explosive could be placed in the middle of a cigar, hidden by tobacco. Probably enough to blow up a car, Jack offered. He turned back to us. I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised that you two know about plastique. They haven't actually allowed you to blow anything up, have they? No, I said. Do you think we could? He smiled. What? I don't think that would be a wise option. We have seen how it's supposed to work, though, Jack went on. Again, Little Bill turned to the lieutenant colonel. On one of their trips into the grounds, they witnessed a mock attempt by 4 of our agents to blow up a train while it was on a trestle, the lieutenant colonel explained. The door opened and Bill walked in carrying a tray. On it sat a teapot, some cups, milk and sugar, and 2 bottles of orange pop. He set it down on the table beside Little Bill. Let me pour, Little Bill said. He picked up the pot and steam rose as he carefully poured tea into the 3 china cups. Sugar and milk, he asked the lieutenant colonel. 1 lump and a dash of milk, please. He took the tongs and placed a single lump of sugar in the cup and then added a little milk. And what would you like? He asked Bill. Just milk, please. He poured milk and then handed the cup and saucer to Bill. And boys, why don't you have your sodas, he said as he passed the bottles over to us. I immediately took a sip. It tasted cold and sweet and refreshing. What with the shortage of sugar, it was pretty rare for us to actually have a soda. Little Bill proceeded to pour himself a cup of tea. The sound in the room was the lieutenant colonel's spoon clinking against the china cup. So, Little Bill began, if I am to understand correctly, in the space of a few short hours, these two young men have managed to infiltrate both a secure manufacturing plant and this highly restricted training school. Bill and Lieutenant Colonel nodded their heads in agreement. We just did what Bill told us, I explained. He sort of trained us. Indeed, Little Bill said. He trained you very well. Bill, if you would now explain things further, I would appreciate it. Bill took a quick sip from his tea and set the cup down in the saucer. I was thinking that our enemy seems to know little in the way of moral boundaries in warfare, so I suspected that they would put no limits on their conduct of espionage. What does that mean? I said it before I realized that I shouldn't be saying anything. I'm sorry. Don't be, George, Little Bill said. It means that the Nazis don't ever fight in a fair or honorable manner. They will do whatever it takes to win, regardless of what they need to do to reach that goal. Exactly, Bill said. And our reason that they wouldn't be above using children or pregnant women or old people to their advantage to deliver bombs and such. I needed some way to test this theory, so I asked the boys to help. And indeed they did. Little Bill paused and took a long sip of his tea. You boys, of course, realize that nothing of what has happened can be discussed with anybody. We signed the oath, Jack said, but we wouldn't have told anybody anyway, I added. When did they sign the secrecy oath? Little Bill asked. After they were found on the grounds the second time, and we became aware of just how much they had observed, the lieutenant colonel explained. And as a result of interviewing the boys, we've made significant changes to the security here at the camp, Bill added anxiously. Have you? Little Bill asked. Then I suppose some other changes may still be in order, wouldn't you think? Bill looked down at his cup. I felt so bad about getting him in trouble. I believe an order should be given to all members of the camp concerning any and all visitors previously known. I'll leave that to your expertise to institute. Please have a word with the gentleman who drove the boys to the compound. He paused and took another sip of tea. Remember, a mistake is only a mistake if you fail to learn from it. Yes, sir, Bill said. I'll go right now and make those. Please, that can wait until we've finished our visit with Jack and George. So, gentlemen, your mother works at the munitions plant. And your father? Would you like their files? The lieutenant colonel asked. Oh, no, certainly not. This is tea, not an interrogation, he answered. So where is your father? He's in the army, I said. In Africa serving with the St. Patrick's Regiment, Jack added. I know that regiment. It is composed entirely of men who volunteered to fight for king and country. You must be very proud of your father. We are, Jack said. And if he were to know what you have done, he would be proud of you both. He would? I was startled to realize that Jack and I had asked the question in unison. Most certainly. Are you aware that you have helped your father? Jack gave me a confused look, one that I was sure was mirrored on my face. You have assisted the men who are training and being trained here. That help will be of benefit to our side in a most terrible form of war. Do you know anybody who has been through a war? Our Uncle Jack was in the First World War, my brother said. I'm named after him. And there's Mr. Crumb, too, I added. He was a hero. Bill and Lieutenant Colonel looked up from their tea and stared at me. Had I said something wrong? Can I refill your cups? Little Bill asked as he lifted the teapot. Both men held out their cups, and he poured more tea. He then added milk to both cups and another cube of sugar to one. I wasn't aware you two knew Mr. Crumb, Little Bill said. I have a paper route, Jack answered, and I help out, but Mr. Crumb said I could have a route of my own soon. Maybe. I'm sure you do an excellent job, George. And Mr. Crumb has spoken to you boys about the last war, has he? Not much about the war, Jack said. That doesn't surprise me. Does your Uncle Jack ever tell you tales of the war? Never. He doesn't talk about it at all. It was a terrible war. I had hoped that we had learned from it, but I was sadly mistaken. Were you in that war, I asked? He nodded his head ever so slightly. Were you in the army? I started in the army, but a gas attack ended my days as a soldier. I was too sick to ever return to the trenches. That's too bad, I said. I thought so too, so I learned to fly above the trenches instead. I became a pilot. You flew one of those old-fashioned airplanes? He nodded his head and smiled. I guess I shouldn't have called them that, but he didn't seem to mind. They certainly seemed that way, looking back, but at the time we thought of them as the finest things imaginable. And Little Bill was among the best, the lieutenant colonel hastened to tell us. He was an ace and was highly decorated. I don't think we should talk of that, Little Bill said. Far too embarrassing. Do you still have your medals, I asked? Little Bill didn't answer right away, but he took a long sip from his cup. I have them. I think they're in an old tobacco tin in the hall closet. Not in a fancy case, Jack asked. That's how Mr. Crumb keeps his, I added. Mr. Crumb has shown you his medals. Yeah, he has a bunch, I told them. Indeed, he was highly decorated. You've seen them too, I asked. Bill and Lieutenant Colonel burst into laughter, and I felt embarrassed for asking. I can understand why you think that, Little Bill said, defending me. I'm familiar with Mr. Crumb by other means. Like the file you have on him, Jack guessed. What makes you think we have a file on him? Because he tried to get in here once, I said, like us. He said he was following a truck filled with lumber because he wanted to see what was being built here. That and other reasons, Little Bill said, taking another sip of his tea. You mean because he's the editor of the paper, I asked. That is significant. My brother thought he was a spy. Jack shot me a dirty look. I knew I'd pay for opening my mouth once we got home. A spy, Little Bill asked. Why would you think that? Well, he was asking about the camp, Jack explained. And when he asked, what did you say? Nothing. Mostly we just listened. He already knew a lot, Jack added. He was the one who told us that it was a special army base. And Jack didn't believe him at first when he said this was an army base. You didn't, Little Bill asked? Jack shook his head slowly and looked even more embarrassed. What did you think was going on here? I sort of thought it was like a German spy base, he said quietly. That's why we kept sneaking into the place. We were looking for spies, but of course we know better now. We know Mr. Crumb's not a spy. He's just asking questions because he's a newspaper man. He's just being nosy, even though he knows he can't print what he finds. Little Bill took another sip of his tea, a long, slow sip. His expression remained calm, but his eyes seemed to get dark and stormy. Do you boys think there might be spies about here? I shrugged. I don't know. Maybe, I guess. Perhaps I've been in this line of work too long, but I believe there are agents of the enemy at work throughout this country. Chief Smith could be a spy, I blurted out. Chief Smith? Little Bill asked. He's the head of the local police force, Bill explained. But really, his name isn't Smith, I said. It's Schmidt, and that's a German name. Indeed, Little Bill said, it is a German name. As German as, say, Braun? Suddenly, I was the one who felt embarrassed. Now, if you boys will excuse us, I must talk to the lieutenant colonel. I put down my empty soda bottle and stood up along with Jack. Little Bill rose to his feet as well. It has been a pleasure to meet two such fine young men. He reached out and shook our hands. Bill, would you be so kind as to arrange to bring them home? Thanks and goodbye, Jack said. And then Bill ushered us from the room, closing the door behind him and leaving the two men alone in the lieutenant colonel's office. I suppose the first thing I should do after dropping you two at home is call Mr. Granger and inform him that I now owe him 2 boxes of cigars, Bill said. Sorry about that, Jack offered. And about getting you in trouble, I added. Nothing to be sorry about. I've been told to fix things and nothing more will be made of it. Little Bill is like that. Is he in charge of the camp? I asked. This camp? He's in charge of a whole lot more than this camp, Bill laughed. I can't really say anything else, but I want you two boys to remember this meeting. One day, probably long after the war is won, you'll learn just who that was. He must be important, I said. More than I can say. Come on, let's get you two home before your mother gets back from work.